Science is more than a body of knowledge. It's a way of thinking, a way of skeptically interrogating the universe with a fine understanding of human fallibility. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along.
Hi, and welcome to The Seeker
and The Skeptic.
I'm Kat, and I'm the flaky, unpredictable, irrational seeker.
And I'm Rebecca. I'll be your sarcastic, grumpy, close-minded, skeptical host. Or maybe we should just be ourselves.
Sounds good to me. This podcast is going to dive deep into controversial topics that some may call new age or woo-woo, or just plain foolish.
And look at them with a skeptical but open-minded approach that will hopefully encourage understanding and acceptance from both the skeptics
and the seekers.
Hi, welcome to this episode of The Seeker and The Skeptic. And this episode, we're going to talk about me.
Yes, today's subject is Rebecca, the skeptic.
That's what I go by.
And I guess how I first met you was knowing that you were the illustrator person. So I was instantly both jealous and intrigued by wanting to know more. And somebody who was both a vegan and a skeptic, which I found, it was an interesting mix. And we're going to dig right into that today. So let's start off with skepticism, because I didn't really know much about this before I met you. But do you want to tell us a little bit how you define it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've written a book called How to Be Reasonable, a comic book. And the reason I use the word reasonable is because that is what I think of as skepticism. I think skepticism is about being reasonable. And the definition I use, which I dug out of some dictionary ages ago, I don't know which one it was, is agreeing to the rules of logic and following evidence and being sensible, fair, and open-minded.
Fair enough.
So it's just like, it's an approach to the world. And I think that's a really important thing to remember about skepticism, is it's a method. It's not a set of beliefs. Obviously there are many beliefs that skeptics have, but skepticism itself is a method for approaching the world, which is basically applying the tools of science and reason to any empirical claim. So if someone says, this magical bracelet can make you fly, say, oh, that's interesting. And then you look for the scientific evidence and you apply the rules of logic to see if that all stacks up and makes sense. And skeptics are particularly interested in claims that seem a bit like they could potentially not be true. Right.
And one of the, how I directly experienced this from you is maybe making a statement like, oh yeah, so when I'm meditating, I just look at my third eye. And then you're like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, what do you mean by that is one of my most favourite phrases.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like you're being attacked. In fact, it makes you feel like you've got somebody who's actually interested in what you're saying. Somebody who isn't just saying like, yeah, sure. Or not even listening to what you're saying. It's nice to talk to a skeptic because it's nice to feel like somebody's actually paying attention to what you're saying, even if you get into a bit of a debate about something.
Almost always. But yeah, that's a big part of skepticism. As I see it, skepticism breaks down into three main things. And the first one is a body of knowledge about how humans' brains work and the common mistakes we make. And that's something that obviously I'm always learning and improving on my knowledge of. But it's basically knowing that human brains malfunction in really predictable ways and then watching out for that in yourself.
Right.
So you're like, oh, I feel like I keep on seeing this black cat and I seem to be having a really shitty time. Could it be that the black cat is unlucky? And then you think, no, actually, because I'm pretty sure I read in this book about this thing called confirmation bias, where you tend to see things that support your theory. So if you think black cats are unlucky, then you'll notice the times when you see one and have a bad day. So just simple things like that, knowing these tricks our brains play on us and being wary of them and being interested in what's going on in your own head. And then obviously your friends, because you want to get a sort of glimpse into who they are and what makes them tick. And then, so I said three things, I guess. So it's the body of knowledge, it's the practice of introspection and careful thinking, of working things through. You can't do this all the time, obviously.
Well, I was going to say, cognitive biases are hard because they are how
they're in your blind spot.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's one of the cool things about skepticism. It's like you have a community of people who are looking out for each other and trying to spot those mistakes in each other, and hopefully pointing them out in respectful ways, although that doesn't always work. So it's the body of knowledge. It's knowing how your brains work. It's a practice of being introspective and thinking about things carefully and sorting through all the reason and evidence, all that boring stuff when you're making important decisions. And then it's an orientation towards truth and towards finding out what's true and what's based in evidence over what makes you feel good or what's popular or what the government tells you or anything of that. It's following the evidence to try and get as close as possible to truth, whilst acknowledging that perfect truth isn't possible for any human being. But yeah, so that's the three things: knowing how your brain works, getting good at introspection and practicing that kind of careful thinking, and always like keeping your eyes on the prize of trying to get as close to truth as possible.
Which sounds like a full-time job. I mean, that in itself, and that's why there are, and the internet itself, it's like a bit of a messy place for that.
Yeah, and it can be really exhausting. Yeah, and that's why I say you can't be perfectly skeptical or reasonable about every single thing. It's nice to be able to lean on your friends who have already done that research or whatever.
Sure.
And the other thing about the skeptic movement, as opposed to just skepticism, is it's not just about truth; it's about compassion. So it's like these two priorities of reason and compassion are always working together. So if we were just concerned about the truth, we'd probably be scientists or philosophers. But because we care about other people, we focus on things that hurt people. So when there's something that's not true that's hurting people, like if there's a rumor going around that you can say a certain little prayer and that'll cure cancer, that's something skeptics would be really concerned about, because it's actually actively hurting people. If people are telling people that they can cure their cancer by saying a prayer, that's something that would really worry us. Whereas if someone says, I looked at my third eye, I mean, that's interesting and I might ask you more about it, but it's not hurting you to believe you have a third eye.
Sure.
Unless you're like driving and you just cover your two normal eyes. It's like, I got the third one. And so, I think skeptics, I mean, this is my position, but I think it's true of most skeptics. I genuinely think that people would be safer, happier, and more effective if we're a bit more reasonable. And that's why I get passionate about it, and that's why I write comics about it, and why I go talk about it to people, because it's made my life so much better, and I want to give other people the opportunity. I'm not going to force it on anyone, but just say, look, these tools are out there and they're so useful, and you're less likely to fall victim to a charlatan. You're more likely to make better choices and therefore be more effective in your life. And there are studies that show, and this is, it's a correlation causation issue, but there are studies that show that people who practice what they call evidence-based thinking actually have happier lives. They live longer, they get better grades. Like, evidence-based thinking is generally like a cool thing to do. So I'm really passionate about promoting it.
No, it does make sense. It does sound reasonable. It's this idea that, for me, a lot of the causes of human suffering are the beliefs we hold.
Yeah.
And if your beliefs are coming from a dodgy, untrustworthy source, including just our own mind, right? And nothing really just comes from thin air, right? We've been told things by society and culture. And being able to actively question that, but without getting too attached to our beliefs.
Yeah.
And that's what I think I really liked about the sound of skepticism and just talking to you about things. It was nice to be able to have differing opinions on things, but no one get too fired up, because we're just you're open to discuss these things.
Although that might be partly a personality thing. I think there are some skeptics who get very upset, and if you push me on the right things, I do get upset. If I think that someone is if I thought that you were falling victim to someone taking advantage of you, taking your money or putting you in a difficult situation health-wise, it'd be hard for me to not get emotional.
Sure.
So we're not all just like robots talking calmly about stuff. But I do think we try to focus on logical reasoning, and we say our emotions inform us, and they can tell us, it's obviously, if you're feeling upset about something, it's probably important, you should look into it. That's a really useful guide. But to use our emotions more as signposts to what to look into, instead of just using them as conclusions. If you feel terrible about something, it might not actually be terrible.
Yeah.
Look into it, because it might be terrible, you might be right, but it's worth checking, using both sort of your intuition, your kind of your fast thinking, your immediate response, and the slow thinking, the really reasoning out from first principles stuff.
Yeah, nice. And so how did you find skepticism? Did I say that right?
Do you find it? Yeah. It's weird. Yeah, I love that. It's like finding Jesus, finding skepticism. I'm going to use that. So I'm going to have to take you way, way back into my childhood, because I'm not naturally inclined towards this sort of thinking. I'm like, I mean, I'm an artist, and I don't know, I don't want to say like other people who aren't artists aren't creative, but I kind of think of myself as having a bit of a more creative brain than average. My brain throws out strange connections and associations.
And you might say that's like high on the openness trait on the Big Five,
Yeah.
which is a real thing.
Yeah. You'll notice, Cal, which is a real thing. Don't question me on that.
I need to preface a lot of the things I say to Rebecca with that. I know what you're thinking.
Yeah, so there's this thing, and I don't know how legit it is, but I read about it. It's this theory that, you know, schizophrenia is not like a defined problem. It's not like a defined disorder. People say that it's more like a spectrum, like the autism spectrum, I guess. And people sit at different points on it. And there are sort of common traits that are associated with this. Like you have unusual experiences. So like you have maybe mild hallucinations, or if you're further at the other end, then you have serious full-on hallucinations. And you have this cognitive disorganization, they call it, which is like you just go off on weird tangents, which you'll notice I do a lot. There are often people who are seriously schizophrenic, introverted, and they are kind of emotionally flat, which is a bit weird. And also there's something called impulsive nonconformity, which is like just doing strange things for the sake of it. So the idea is that instead of it being like schizophrenic people are these weirdos who are in their own separate category, that we all exist somewhere on the spectrum. And what they call positive schizotypy is something that is common in artists and creative people. And it's basically like that stuff, the unusual experiences, the cognitive distortions, particularly, they're likely to make you be kind of creative. Yeah. And it's a sort of personality type that isn't bad unless it goes too far and ends up ruining your life. In fact, it can actually be good in small doses. Yeah. And so when I started reading about, you know, how our brains work and reading skeptical literature about the mistakes our brains make, what kept cropping up to me was this thing of patternicity, which is basically the tendency to make connections between things that may or may not exist.
Which is, again, a trait of a creative.
Yeah, so like seeing, if you look up a cloud and you think, oh, that kind of looks like a bunny rabbit, that would be an example of patternicity, a very simple example, but drawing connections between things. So I'm not saying I'm some kind of magical person, but I am inclined towards magical thinking. And as a kid, that just went all over the place. It took me into all sorts of strange places. I spent a lot of time in the library, like cross-referencing books about werewolves with books about, I don't know, climate change, all these weird like little routes I go down that I was fascinated in. And I didn't have a system for defining which were true and which were false. I just knew what was interesting and what just sounded good to me.
And as a kid, anything you read in a book is real. Why wouldn't it be?
Yeah, especially if it's in the non-fiction section. Like, well, it must be real. So I just reading around, and like I was an introverted kid, and I just spent a lot of time in the library reading all this stuff and believing what entertained me and what was a good story. And I mean, like, this is another interesting theory about people who veer towards more sort of spiritual, paranormal beliefs, in fact. Often these people are people who experience like a lack of control in childhood, who don't feel like they have efficacy. And so they're drawn to a world where they feel like they do have efficacy. They like create their own world, their own sphere of influence that they can control. This is a theory promulgated by a guy called Harvey Irwin. He's some kind of psychologist who deals with religion and particularly like alternative religions, fringe religion stuff. So I had like not a good time at home. My home life was just very disorganized, and I didn't know who was going to be there. Like when I turned up at home, I didn't know who was going to look after me or what was going on. And I had this brain that kept on making connections which were unusual. And I had the library and the resources of the non-fiction section. And so I just delved into all the supernatural paranormal stuff, and I loved it. And it was like a world that was my world, and it was exciting, and other people didn't know about it, so it felt special to me. Just got really, really into that. And then at some point I met other people and connected with other people who had similar worldview, and it all sort of went on from there.
So that is the bit that interests me, because I can imagine whether it's little Rebecca getting into this stuff, but also myself, like in my childhood, having those things that, you know, I thought I was the only one who was interested in the thing, but for me it stayed that way. Whereas I'm interested in the fact that you found other kids. So what age would you say that you really started to bond with your friends over this?
Well, it's kind of two directions, because other kids, but also my dad remarried. I was living with my dad and my brother, and my dad married this woman who was a shaman.
Okay.
As you do. I mean, a white British shaman, if such a thing can exist, white British middle-class shaman. And she did shamanic practice out of our spare room, her healing room, she called it. In fact, she worked in shamanic traditions, but she mainly focused on, I can't remember what you call it. It's healing where you just like hover your hand over. It's not Reiki, but it looks very like Reiki.
Not cranial, no, they touch.
No.
Okay.
I can't remember exactly what the tradition she was, but it was that like, you're supposed to feel energy in your hands and then you hold them over people. So she'd have clients in and out of our spare room. And also she would go to these mind, body, spirit fairs.
Oh, yeah.
Which I haven't been to one for years, but I grew up at these things, or at least I spent a significant proportion of my childhood. Just like we'd all drive out there, we'd set up her table, and then there were 5 kids, because she had 3 kids and me and my brother. We'd just roam around,
right,
looking at all the tarot cards, picking up the crystals, doing all that stuff. It was part of my world. So not only was all the paranormal stuff in the library and written as if it was true, but I was surrounded by adults.
Adults, right.
Who no one was saying, hey, wait, this might be nonsense.
Why would you question it?
Yeah.
So was your dad into it as well?
I don't know. I think he just thought it was like he wasn't into it or not into it.
Yeah.
He has told me that he saw some kind of like energy, I think they call them orbs, like floating energy balls around, and he has a couple of slightly wacky ideas, but he was never like full into it. He was just like, oh, that's a fun thing my wife does.
Yeah, I've noticed this about certain people. They can kind of take it or leave it.
Yeah.
They're not going to get super into the thing, nor are they going to dismiss it actively. It's a really, I've been talking to my own family about it and trying to work out the differences. But like you said, some people get drawn to something and some people get actively, question it. But
it's fascinating to try and figure out what it is about someone's history or personality that makes them particularly prone to taking up these beliefs. Yeah. Because it is unusual.
Yeah.
Like, although not that unusual, they say like around 50% of the population have paranormal beliefs of some sort.
Yeah, so it's
not super unusual, but it is. Yeah, I think it's an interesting project to try and figure it out, although it's really hard, especially when you're talking about your own life, because, our memories are so rubbish. And
there are so many variables, whether it's, even as deep down as genetically being predisposed to some way of thinking, to just the fact that your dad happened to marry a shaman, it's all of that stuff. So, again, and then you had other friends.
Yeah,
who were also...
so I met, I was kind of one of those kids. I was a bit of a goth, as you might expect. I spent my time worrying about werewolves and spontaneous human combustion. I was a bit of a goth. Although I don't think I ever called myself a goth, but I wore black and I generally presented as a pretty miserable person. Black fingernail polish and stuff like that. And I was really into school. I worked really hard, so I was a nerd and a goth, which is not a good combination. And you know how, like, if you're in the out group, you form really strong bonds with the other people in the out group. And other people in that group, you just start to float ideas like, oh, have you heard of tarot reading? And someone else has, and they're kind of into it. And then you just pick up a few people. So in the end, I think maybe like 7 or 8 of us who maybe not interesting, but they were from the years above and below us. Well, it wasn't just my year, because we were real oddballs. And
same in my school. The goth kids were from different years.
Yeah,
and that was a nice thing to.
You can't just get your friendship when you're that weird. You can't find that many people on your wavelength in your own year group.
Yeah.
So I don't know who was the first to float this idea, but we all started reading about Wicca and witchcraft. And me and my friend, who I'll call Jim, because I don't know if he wants to be outed as a witch or as an ex-witch. So me and my friend Jim were like really into it, and we were reading a lot. And he was a nerd too, and we got together and we read about it. And I spoke to some of the women at the Mind Body Spirit fairs, and there was this thing, and I think this is common if you go to get a tarot card reading or speak to anyone who's into this thing, where they look at you and they say, oh, there's something about you. There's something, you're a bit touched, you're a bit empathic, you've got the way of the spider about you. I've been told that. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what that meant, but I took it to mean that I was on the right path, and that pursuing this whole Wicca thing is interesting. And Wicca is such a interesting and bizarre religion. But back then, I took it to be a religion that was pre-Roman, that came from the British Isles, that had been suppressed during the witch burning, which Wiccans refer to as the burning times, and had managed to survive in small pockets until in like 1951, the last Witchcraft Act, because there were Witchcraft Acts which persecuted witches, and then there were later Witchcraft Acts which persecuted people persecuting witches. Right. And then there was the last Witchcraft Act was against anyone who claimed to have magical powers. Because they're like, look, guys, stop claiming to have magical powers. It just ends this
once and for all
nonsense and people getting murdered. So, but that wasn't repealed until 1951. In 1951, this guy, Gerald Gardner, who was a retired civil servant who lived in the New Forest, which is like a beautiful part of the UK, he always been interested in the occult and stuff, and he claimed to have made contact with a remnant of this old religion and have been initiated into their traditions. And now the last Witchcraft Act is repealed, he's going to reveal it to the public. And he wrote several books. I think the biggest one was probably Witchcraft Today. But more importantly, he started his own coven and started hiving off. When a coven gets to a certain size, a coven is a group of witches or Wiccans, it gets to a certain size, it splits off and forms other covens. So traditional size is 13. If it gets bigger than that, you have to hive off and create a new coven. And he just did that like on steroids.
Oh, wow.
He created so many new covens. He just populated the whole of the UK with covens, and he just initiated people who didn't really even know that much about the whole thing. He would just initiate them, call them a high priestess, and send them off to start their own coven. And from there, people read his work and said, oh, I like this bit of what he's saying and not this bit, and I like this bit and not this bit, and created their own traditions. And then it spread to America, it spread to Australia, it's all over the world now. But it's a religion that started with this one guy who claims to have the ancient text that's been passed down from pre-Roman, the old religion. That's what they refer to it as, the old religion.
So he basically started a new religion.
Exactly,
it's almost like, think about the Bible, like Old Testament and New Testament. He was like a Jesus of the witches.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, he's called the father of witchcraft. Right. That's what he's referred to as. And the book that he produced, that he said he got from this mysterious high priestess who ran a coven in the New Forest. If you look at it, and I've looked at it, it's interesting, it's in a museum, and it's all stuff that's clearly drawn from Western esotericism and like Aleister Crowley and all that sort of stuff. It's a mishmash of that and some medieval traditions thrown in. There's nothing really, if you look at it with an honest, like, scholarly eye, instead of someone who really wants to believe that there's an old religion, you can see that it's kind of a collage of what was popular at the time, and there's nothing that really looks particularly ancient. And there's this weirdness about this whole story that he came up with, that he got this book from this coven and that he was initiated by this coven, because he generally refused to say the name of the high priestess of the coven who passed it on. But in a letter to someone at some point, which we have, he refers to her as Clutterbuck, and then in other places he refers to her as Old Dorothy. And there was a Dorothy Clutterbuck living nearby in Highcliffe, which is just on the outskirts of the New Forest by the seaside at the time. So people were like, brilliant, we found her. We found the high priestess who passed this on. Let's go and look into her. And amazingly, she kept diaries. So we actually have the diaries of this woman who Gardner claimed was a high priestess. Unfortunately, though, disappointingly for me, they're not the diaries of a witch. They're the diaries of like a pious Christian widow. It turns out she's like this high society woman who was kind of fancy, and like she had this, I've been to her house. So I got really into this. I had to go see her grave. I had to go see where she lived. I needed to know for myself whether I'd been misled about this stuff. Because this is before. Now you can look this up on the internet.
I was going to say, you didn't have the access to that. And so obviously the discovery of this, you could say today, some kid finds out some information about Gerald Gardner, gets into it a little bit. It wouldn't take them that long, in theory, before they start coming up against other evidence.
Yeah, it's on his Wikipedia page. Right. I mean, you could probably find almost everything I've said on his Wikipedia page. It's not a secret, but it was a secret then. And the only stuff that I was reading was stuff I picked up in the Wicca section in the Mind, Body, Spirit shops, and they all said this as if it was true. The day that Gardner names a date when he was initiated into the New Forest Coven by mysterious old Dorothy. On that date, we know exactly where Dorothy Clutterbuck was because she was putting up a gravestone for her husband. And I've been to visit that gravestone, and it's like in all of the graveyard, it's the one with the most Christian stuff on it. Like it's a really heavily. So I mean, it is possible, implausible, but possible that she was living a double life.
Yeah. And so is that what you were telling yourself when you found all of this out?
No, I found this out much later. So this was like the last part of my religion to let go of. But anyway, so that's what Wicca is. Wicca is a neo-pagan reconstructionist religion. It's people trying to recreate the religion from pre-Roman days based on just no evidence at all, basically, because we know so little about, they didn't keep written records, we don't know anything about them. And it started off with this one guy who said, we do actually have lots of evidence because I have this specific book, this Book of Shadow that's been passed down, and unfortunately that fell apart. But the religion carried on, even though most, I don't want to say most, maybe most, I don't know what the percentage is like, but if you talk to Wiccans today, most of them acknowledge that this is not true, that the sacred history is not true, but they just say that they love what it does for them and they love their religion, and they don't see any reason to let go of it just because it's based on a story that didn't turn out to be true, because in their lives it's very fulfilling and enriching and stuff. So
wow. And how did the start of the end for you? I mean, how did you go from one day you're believing this thing and one day it's all tumbling down and you're looking at a grave from an old lady?
Well, I left the UK. I started traveling, and I was a big part of Wicca is the Wheel of the Year. And so it's like the Wheel of the Year is 8 seasonal celebrations. So there's winter solstice, summer solstice, the 2 equinoxes, and then 4 cross-quarter days that fall between them. And a really, really important aspect of Wicca, even more important than the sacred history or anything else, is ritual. That's what bonds us together. We get together on those dates and we do certain things. And they all consist of calling a circle, which is basically making a sacred space by acknowledging the elements at different compass points. So what my coven would do is we'd go out into this beautiful place in the woods, and we'd take candles and we'd take food and we'd take scarves and daggers and all the other ceremonial equipment we needed, and we'd put it all up, tie ribbons around the trees, light candles, call the corners, create a circle, and then we'd do ritual, and that ritual would be different depending on the time of year. So it would either be focused, if it was the beginning of the year, if it was Beltane, which is a festival that is like May Day, falls on May Day. It would be all about new life and celebrations, and we'd maybe do spells around what we wanted to achieve in this sort of fruitful part of the year, and blah blah blah. And then if we were all gathering for Samhain, for Halloween, it would be all about ancestors and the closing of a year, because Halloween or Samhain is the Wiccans' New Year's. That's the end of the year for them. So the point is that we get together 8 times in the year, and it was very important. It was very connected to the geography of the south of England, which is where the religion was invented, and that agricultural season, and like living in harmony with that particular part of nature. So when you start to travel, it's kind of weird because you can't celebrate midsummer when you're in an equatorial country. It doesn't make any sense. And I lived in Australia for a while, and everything there is flipped, and there are Wiccans there, and they just celebrate all the festivals backwards, but that didn't feel quite right. Yeah. And then the other thing that's happening at the same time is, obviously, as I travelled, this was the first time I'd really travelled outside the UK, and we really went for it. We went everywhere. We went all across Africa, we went to India, went through Southeast Asia, and I was encountering all these new religions that I'd never encountered before. Because the only religions I've really encountered, my parents are atheists, so the only religion, I mean, I knew people around at school and stuff who were Christians, so I'd encountered Christianity, and I'd encountered New Age religions, including Wicca. That's all I'd got. And I was like, well, out of the bunch that I've seen, Wicca is clearly the best. But then I was seeing all these other ones. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Like, why is my religion more true than Hinduism or Buddhism or any of these other religions I met on my travels? And I started to doubt that, and then also being undermined and not having that sense of place anymore, not having, my friends, my Wiccan friends to celebrate seasonal festivals. So it's all starting to feel a bit,
I guess it sounds like it weakened, right? Yeah. The tie you had to it, which, like you said, is mostly formed around ritual and connection with people that plus, I'm sure you came across some other religions that almost appealed in a similar way.
Yeah.
And in that way, again, you're undermining the thing that you have.
And then at some point, I start working. So I travelled a lot, moved back to UK, moved to Australia, got at some point along this journey, managed to do my degree and a postgraduate degree. And then I ended up working in a tattoo studio, as you do when you've just got your master's in English literature. What should I do with this? So there was a guy there who believed that the government was fluoridating the Australian water supply to keep Australians stupid. That is his belief. And that was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. I was like, no, I can't just believe everything now.
Right.
Because that's too much. I can't, because if you have no filter system for what you believe, you end up believing all these things that contradict each other.
Yes.
And I feel like it's almost stressful.
Yes,
like there's too much cognitive tension. Like, how can I believe one thing and believe the other? And how can I believe that my religion is true and also Buddhism is true? Like, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I needed to find some kind of sorting mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
So I go online, because by now I can go online. This is like, I don't know when this was. Early 2000s?
Mm-hmm.
No, not early 2000s. Mid 2000s. No, we're not even in the mid 2000s yet. Yeah. I don't know. It's some time. But I had access to the internet, so I start looking this stuff up, and I've come across skeptics, basically. Skeptics questioning the fluoride in the water thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, these people seem to have a system. They have a system for determining what's true and what's false. Mm. And that's what I need. That's exactly what I need. So I was like, okay, fine. I'll start looking into other things. And I just started with stuff that I wasn't really that interested in. So I started with stuff like Bigfoot, cryptozoology stuff. Like, I've never believed in any of that stuff, but it's interesting. Looked into werewolves because I remember them from when I was a kid. And then slowly I crept up on my own beliefs, and I eventually got to magic. And I started looking at like what skeptics had to say about magic, and everything they said made sense. And I suddenly started realizing that I'd been doing these spells. Like, I'd do a spell to attract love into my life, and then, you know, a couple of days later, some guy would make eye contact with me. I'd be like, yes, spell worked. And I was like, oh, this sounds a bit like what those skeptics are saying is confirmation bias. Is it possibly that I've just primed myself to notice these things? And then I thought, also, there's another sort of level of this, because it's not only that I cast a spell and I look around to see if it worked, and I only notice or remember the stuff that suggests it did, but also, if my spell doesn't work, I forget that spell.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm selecting
the things that work, omitting the things that didn't
exactly.
work.
I've cultivated this body of evidence or beliefs or whatever you want to call it to support the position, which is I believe in magic.
And if you're really great at forming patterns, that might even be turned up.
Yeah, I feel like I was really good at it. I feel like I could have argued with a lot of different people about my beliefs and been quite convincing, because it's a skill I have of putting things together in that kind of order.
Yeah. So it sounds like you were kind of already ready to let go of some of these beliefs. I feel like had you started Googling things earlier, or given the chance to Google them earlier, maybe you wouldn't have looked so hard.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's what was happening? Like you were kind of...
I think I'd reached a natural point where I was exhausted. I was exhausted with believing so many contradictory things. Yeah. I was like, I mean, a lot of my beliefs were really like life affirming and wonderful, and like, you know, that I can control energies by using magic, and that I have this place in the world and this link to this great lineage of history. All that stuff is really empowering, but also I believe stuff that was super scary. So I believe, because you can't just believe in positive things, I believed in all the negative side of that too. So I believed that there were sort of entities which were evil that were present in the world that I had to be careful about. That's scary. If you believe that there are, and especially with someone who is prone to, you know, seeing weird things in the corner of their eyes, which is actually really common. I read a brilliant book by Oliver Sacks. I can't remember what it's called. It might just be called Hallucinations. But it's basically about how so many people have hallucinations. Almost everyone does. It's very uncommon not to have hallucinations.
I don't.
You don't think you do, but that's the weird thing.
Yeah, I mean, I remember recently, I can't remember where I was, but I was on the beach, and I kept seeing the top of one of the like the railings, say, that lead down onto the beach. I kept thinking it was somebody's head, and I did it more than once. Yeah. And the feeling you get when something goes from being, I think that's a person, to, oh no, that's an inanimate object. Well, it's just very
weird.
strange.
Yeah, I get that stuff all the time. Like, I'll see a piece of seaweed on the beach and I'm convinced it's like a lizard or something, because that's what it looks like, and my brain just makes up the rest. And that's just what our brains do, because our eyes are super simple. Our eyes are like cameras. I mean, they're not super simple. It's not like I'm not impressed by eyes, but when that information gets translated onto our brain, we have to reconstruct the image.
Yeah.
And because our eyes only see, for example, I believe this is true, we only see like static images. So our brains just like stitch it together. It's like animation. So if you watch a cartoon, they're one frame after another, and your brain makes it into movement. Yeah. And our brains are doing that all the time when we look around. So hallucinations are kind of like a natural feature of our brain. There's something our brain does by itself just to make sense of the world.
Yeah, it's guesswork.
Yeah, exactly. It's just guesswork. And so it's unsurprising that some people would find that happens more than it needs to. And I think that's a very common affliction. It's not really even an affliction. It's just a thing that brains do. And now I just think of it as something, oh, look. Like I was actually at a skeptics conference, and I was really tired, and it had just been one of those, it was like a really big thing, and I've been paying loads of attention. My brain was knackered. And I saw a poster, we're in Vegas, and I saw a poster of a magician or something that was advertised, and he winked at me. And I was like, wow, they have amazing posters in Vegas. Like, it looks like a normal poster, but it must be like a screen. So I go for a closer look, it's not. I just imagined it. I just I blinked, my head was at a funny angle, the light was weird, and I imagined him winking at me. But that is the sort of thing that back in the day, I would have interpreted as a message or whatever, because I just didn't understand how our brains work. And
so do you have any kind of like, since then, has there been anything that you would say is not so good about skepticism, and like almost that you preferred pre-skepticism? Or was it like always good from the start? You were like, okay, great, I'm glad I found this now. This is working for me. Yeah, well, I feel to some degree locked out of some stuff that I used to enjoy. Like I'm always going to feel like an outsider in a yoga class now. And I actually really like yoga. And I think stretching is very relaxing. And that's the kind of yoga I do. I don't do the really dynamic type. I have done it in the past, don't like it. I do the very gentle, stretchy type of just relaxing and having a stretch. And I like that stuff. But then there's always the guided meditation at the end where they ask you to imagine your chakras opening. I'm like, oh, I'm not one of you guys. That sucks. Sure. So there's that feeling of like being an outsider in spaces which to me feel like my spaces, because I grew up in those spaces. Having a stepmother who was involved in that world, my dad and her divorced. So this was only a brief, I don't know, like 5 years maybe of my childhood, but it was one of, that age where everything seems super important. Yeah. So yeah, I feel like that is my world, but I can't really get into, like, that's my culture. That's the culture I was brought up in. Sure. But I'm outside it, which is a bit weird. But then again, I mean, one of the great things about going to a skeptics conference for the first time is feeling like you're among your people. And feeling like we're all working from the same basis here. And I can say anything I want. As long as I'm doing my best to be reasonable, they're going to accept that, which is an amazing feeling. Yeah. So you're kind of getting that community from the skepticism movement in a way. Yeah, oh, definitely. I think that's a big thing it provides, yeah. And the other thing that I mentioned was Rebecca the vegan. Like, this is something else that I kind of knew about you. And I'm just kind of thinking, does that also answer some kind of community for you? Well, this is what makes me feel on the outside of the skeptic world. Sure. Because there are not many skeptics who are vegans, although there are some, and we're a growing minority. And I think I know them all, because there's only a few of us, so we have to know each other. But yeah, so this was one of the things that I came to when I was like, oh, I have to start looking through all these assumptions, beliefs I have about the world. And I was a vegetarian. My mum was a vegetarian, and I went vegetarian when I was 10, because that was the age where it sort of clicked for me that meat was made of animals. Yeah. And you see it in the supermarket, and it's like, whoa. Yeah, exactly. In fact, I had those moments. Yeah. I remember getting a beef burger, and I was out shopping with my dad, and he was like, let's get some of these are your favourite. And I'd never seen them uncooked before. And I saw them uncooked, and I was like, I can't eat that. It's all red and bloody. And because my mum was a vegetarian, it was easy for me to say, I want to be like my mum. Yes. Yeah. And also possibly because she left shortly after that. That's, having that connection with my mum. Yeah. So I was just a vegetarian. I didn't think about it. I was just, I'm a vegetarian because I don't want to kill animals, or I don't want to be responsible for the deaths of animals. And it was a very simple decision, and I never looked into it again, really. I was never particularly involved in vegetarian activism or anything. It was just a facet of my personality that was completely unexplored. And then I'm going through this process of like
skeptically analysing everything I believe, and it's vegetarian's term.
Yeah,
Like, let's look at this. Let's see how this works out. So I sort of broke it down. I was like, why am I a vegetarian? I'm a vegetarian because I don't want to be responsible for the suffering of animals. And then, damn you, Google, I start looking into the dairy industry and all of that stuff, and eggs, and I just find out there's loads of suffering in that.
Yeah.
So there's three sort of things coming together at this three sort of facts that I've been forced to acknowledge, whether I like it or not. And I did not like it, which is that this is something that I knew, but I was getting confirmed from what I was researching on the internet, that animals are conscious and they're capable of suffering. And that's just the scientific consensus now. And if you think about it, it'd be weird if they weren't.
Right,
because we're animals, right? So, but I mean, if you want to go and look it up, there's papers on this. People have looked in animals' brains. You can see that they have nociception, which is perception of pain. We know they feel pain. And there's a whole bunch of cognitive neuroscientists, neurophysiologists, all those guys who've got together. They've actually published a paper called the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, saying, settling this once and for all, almost all animals are conscious. Let's stop having this debate. So that's not really up for debate anymore. And then the fact that farms are horrible and that animals suffer in farms, again, there's a wealth of evidence about that on YouTube, all of it equally disgusting. Like, you could just spend your whole life looking at these heartbreaking images and videos from farms. And unfortunately, that's dairy and eggs as well as meat. And then the fact that being vegan is healthy. I mean, I'm not saying it's the best way to live, but the NHS, the ADA, all these, well-respected authorities on health for humans say a well-planned vegan diet is healthy. So if it's healthy, and if animals are conscious and capable of suffering, and if they do suffer in animal agriculture, you're kind of trapped. If you care, and I did care, that's the position I came from, that's why I was a vegetarian. If you care about the suffering of animals and you acknowledge those three facts, and I don't see how you can not acknowledge them, then you're fucked, you have to go vegan. And that's where I found myself. It's like I logicked myself into the situation where I didn't have any choice.
Yeah. And do you speak to other skeptics who obviously don't hold that view? What are their qualms with it?
Well, there's a lot of, I think veganism particularly, although vegetarianism also to some degree, has a bad rap because it's associated with other hippie stuff. So they'll just
assume that you've also got these other beliefs.
Yeah, there's like a cluster of beliefs that go along with being vegan, and I've spent quite a lot of time at vegan festivals and vegan meetup groups and stuff, and it's true, we are an unusual bunch and we have unusual beliefs, and I think that's partly because we are naturally kind of iconoclastic. That's why we're vegan, right? Because we questioned our reality. We questioned the nature of our reality. And you start questioning the nature of your reality, and unless you have a good rational heuristic to judge stuff, you might decide that eating animals is wrong, but you might also decide that aliens are real. You might decide, all sorts of things you might decide. And it frustrates me and worries me that there's so much pseudoscience in the vegan community. So I think from a skeptic's perspective, you just see this bunch of people. They have these wacky beliefs, and they also don't eat animals, which is a normal thing to do in our culture. And it's easy to just say, well, I won't engage with any of that stuff. But so there's like a test question that skeptics do. I've had this so many times. The test question is, would you be okay with eating test tube meat?
Yes.
What they're testing for is your position on not eating meat a logical, moral one? Or are you just like, ew, meat? Because if you're in the latter category, they're not going to listen to you because they think you're irrational.
And this is what I find so interesting. And just as somebody who was almost anti-vegan, before, because of these assumptions that I had about the community, I assumed that most people just hadn't thought. And it was that kind of, oh, it's just gross. Because I remember my sister having that kind of take on meat. In fact, one of her friends didn't eat meat because she didn't like animals.
What?
Yeah, irrational, right? Because if you dislike animals so much, she doesn't even want to eat them. And that to me struck me, even as a very little kid, very silly.
That is a bit weird. I've never heard that one before.
It's a new one. And again, my irrational assumption was that it's almost like you've got the Venn diagrams and like all vegans must have irrational beliefs. But like it's quite the opposite when I started talking to you and realizing that you'd work things through and reluctantly kind of came to the
Well, I don't
conclusion.
think that I don't think I'm a good representative. I think I'm a good representative because I think I'm good. But I don't think that I am, what's the word? I don't think I'm typical.
Sure, yeah.
I think there are a lot of strange beliefs, and there are a lot of vegans who have strange beliefs. But generally, even though they are a bit wacky, they're good people. They are genuinely trying to do something good for the world.
Exactly. The reason most people are vegan, it's definitely not for a bad thing.
No.
Yeah.
But they're not all completely rational, which is a shame. And I really think that we would do better as a movement. I mean, there are issues in the vegan movement with pseudoscience, as I say, with alternative medicine and all sorts of things which are actually making us that are dangerous to the vegan movement, and just false information about nutrition, like vegans saying that you don't need to take B12, you don't need to supplement with B12. You do. That's something that vegans need to do. You might be able to get it supplemented in food, but you need to get it somehow, and saying that you don't need it is really dangerous. So there's dangerous stuff that really worries me, because I care about vegans and I think they're good people and I don't want them to be taken advantage of or misled. And then the other aspect of it is, you're making us look crazy, guys.
Yeah,
like, how are we going to tell people the good news of veganism if you're around there messing around with your crystals? And...
Yeah. And also when it gets to the point where, I mean, again, a stereotype is like the militant vegan who almost creates more trouble than good, doing more harm than good through protest. But then at the same time, I don't have any solid examples of that. It's just again, it's a stereotype. Which is unfortunate.
It's also, the loudest people are the ones you remember.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a confirmation bias thing, because you have this image of the militant vegan. I certainly had it before I went vegan as well. And those are the ones I notice. And they're also super loud and aggressive, so they're more noticeable.
It's hard to get on with somebody who's just telling you, like, you're wrong, you're a weak, bad person because you do this thing, which is arguable. Because I can, seeing it from their point of view, it's like, again, like the Nazi thing. It's kind of like, well, you might as well. And you can go down those routes. So no, that's interesting. We will cover veganism more in depth on another podcast. I want to know what your idea of a utopia is. And this is just kind of my way of trying to get an idea of what your worldview is. What's the best case scenario for us?
What's the best case scenario for us? I don't know. I think the word utopia is really problematic.
Why
to
is that?
Use a word that I don't like. And the whole concept of utopia. Well, it means no place, right? That's the literal definition of utopia.
Know.
Yeah, because it can't exist.
Okay.
But I started to thinking about my utopia, because it kind of implies that you'd make decisions for other people about what would be the best life for them. And I don't know how to do that, or how I would even start to do that. Because if I was going to create a whole society, I'd have to create a society where everyone suffered as little as possible and everyone reached their full potential and all that stuff. But how would you even go? I don't know how you would even start on that project, because you'd have to know what would constitute suffering for people. You'd want to know how people would thrive. Yeah. And I just can't assume that everyone wants the same things as me.
Sure.
And also as a vegan, it's tempting to say, well, my utopia would be no one eats any animals, and we all, it's like the Garden of Eden, we all dance around and the lion lies down with the lamb or whatever. But I don't want to enforce my moral position on other people. I really think that being vegan is the right thing to do, but I would never force anyone else to do it.
That's interesting. Okay. And same with skepticism? You're saying that you wouldn't even enforce that on people? I
guess... So my utopia maybe would be everyone has the tools of skepticism at their disposal.
That's
so they
nice.
can make decisions that they can make their own decisions that empower them.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's not necessarily a case of some people, although probably some people would reject skepticism. Mostly people just don't know. People aren't informed about this stuff.
I agree. And even because it's really interesting to think, are people choosing beliefs that don't serve them? And there is evidence to suggest that people are, which is wacky. And it's usually because, and this is more of a psychological thing, you can go down that route, but it's that idea that you're choosing a belief that technically isn't serving you, but it's giving you some kind of reward. For example, with the Wicca stuff, you could have rejected the skeptical eye on that because it was serving enough of something else in you. So it's interesting that to me it is fascinating that anyone could reject skepticism, because to me it seems obvious that surely we'd all be trying to find some version of truth.
Yeah.
But I found it even in myself and in our conversations so far, like there are plenty of beliefs that I'm deliberately choosing, even though it's not entirely serving me or the world.
But how, see, this is what I find really hard talking about beliefs, because what is a belief? Like, how can you choose but I feel like beliefs are something
for example, so with the, particularly with like veganism and health, my belief might be that I cannot be healthy on a vegan diet.
Yeah.
And no matter how much information that I've got to this point, I haven't been able to believe otherwise. Could that be changed? Possibly. But maybe there's also part of me that's like clinging to that not being the case. I don't know.
But
maybe
if you're suspicious that you're clinging to it, then surely it's not really a belief.
Well, it's not.
It's just an idea that you're...
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, this is a really difficult topic. Like, because I feel like belief is either a fact about the world that you're aware of, or it's a story you're telling yourself.
Okay, so I think that some beliefs can't be proven either way.
Yeah.
And I live in a world where virtually nothing can be proven to me. Even science, I'm like, that's the evidence we've got from this group of people.
Yeah.
So I'm like living, everything is a belief in a way.
That's a really weird way to
It probably
live.
is. Yeah, maybe. There's actually a name for it and I can't remember what it's called. It's like a characteristic of somebody.
Oh, like a personality trait?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Well, I have to look that one up.
Yeah, I don't know. So yeah, utopia. I think maybe because I'm so focused on freedom. Like I like the idea of people being free to make their own choices, and there seems to be something in the idea of designing a utopia that contravenes people's personal freedom. Because I'd be saying, oh, I think it's best that we have this system and that you do this and you do this, and that will make you happy. And it's not just that I don't think that I'm able to do that. I'm not sure anyone is able to do that. So I guess like if I was going to have any kind of utopia, it would be a personal utopia. And that kind of links to my interest in meditation, which is again something that, although not so much in the last few years, skeptics have become more open to meditation, but it's something that raises eyebrows within the skeptical community, and reasonably so, because there are a lot of claims made for meditation which are just complete BS. Yeah. But anyway, that I found using cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a really well-evidenced type of therapy where you basically train your brain to think in more productive patterns, because I'm naturally anxious and a bit, bonkers. So training my brain to think in a more rational and calm way has been really helpful. And what's really helped with that is meditation. So if I can imagine that I just get better and better at that. If I think about like myself in my teens, just a complete mess, and myself in my 20s, just beset by anxiety, myself in my late 20s, managing a little bit better, and myself in my early 30s now, who's actually kind of okay. So if I project forward from that, from the gains that I've made in being able to sort of manage my own thoughts and feelings, then maybe I can imagine a utopia where I have complete control. And then it doesn't matter what happens in the outside world, right? And this is kind of what the Buddhists talk about when they talk about enlightenment. And I know it's not a reasonable goal, but we're talking utopias, and utopias are no place. It's not reasonable to think about utopia. So forgive me, but if we're going to talk about utopia, that's my utopia. Being able to not, like, I can be in any situation and stuff can happen to me, and I can just either let it happen and be part of it, or step back, and I can have complete control. Yeah. And this is what keeps coming up, right? Because I talked right at the beginning about growing up and not feeling like I had control over my life because of my disorganized childhood. Yeah. And now my project to gain more internal control of my own thoughts and feelings, it's all the same thing. It's all about control. It's about wanting to feel safe.
Yeah. It's so funny. I mean, maybe this is something we can subconsciously bond over, but when I had one coaching session, somebody asked me, what do you think is your biggest challenge? And I was like, my need for control. Because as soon as you start realizing that and tying it up, particularly in childhood, a lot of things will always come back to that. And, you could say, I'm sure, the Buddha might have said, our desires are the kind of cause of suffering. It's like, well, desire for control is like, for me anyway.
So maybe that's actually the next level. Yeah. I don't really want control. I want to get comfortable with the fact that I don't have control.
Oh, yeah.
That's the good stuff. That's the hardcore.
In a way, I think that's the one I think you can achieve in your lifetime.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's cool.
Well, I don't know if I can achieve it, but
it sounds like you're getting closer. So that's nice. I wanted to know about any experiences you have with the unknown, and by that I mean anything inexplicable, things that you can't explain with skepticism.
It's really difficult. I mean, I have lots from back in the day. I mean, as I said, I experience mild hallucinations commonly,
but you've explained them now, so
yeah, exactly. So they're not really unexplained. I mean, there's lots of stuff I don't know. I mean, the other day I was reading about this whole area of space where there are no stars. It's like a big sphere. I haven't looked into it that much. I can't even remember what it's called, but it's a big sphere in space, like huge sphere, and there are no stars in it. What's that about? I don't know. It could be anything.
I heard one the other day, which I wanted to run by you, which is, have you heard about like the triangles that people see in the sky? It's like the most commonly spotted kind of UFO.
Oh, like a UFO. Yeah, the black triangles. Yeah.
Yeah. What's the deal with that?
Oh, well, there are loads of things that could be. I mean, it could be just people being mistaken and seeing, our eyes play tricks on us all the time.
There are too many of them.
There's probably a lot of them that are that. It could be airplanes that they're unfamiliar with how they look. It could be a normal airplane, but they've never seen one quite like this before.
But they just hover.
That seems very strange.
They like change shape.
It could be some kind of technology that we're not aware of.
I think that's
that comes from our own planet, or it could be aliens.
Yeah,
that's the spectrum of options that are available to us.
Aliens. I just had, and this is how my mind works. I heard it from my brother, trusted source. Again, because it's somebody close to you, you're more likely to believe something, right? And then hearing from that person that it's like there are lots of other people saying the same thing. That's almost for me, even though I've not even looked into this thing enough to be like, well, that's proof of aliens. And skeptics, but you must run into that all the time, that way of thinking. And I know I'm being like, that is unreasonable. I did not pass the reasonable test, and I'm aware of that. I'm not so interested. It's just interesting.
I think it's about how much evidence you need to be convinced of something.
That's it.
And for me, a bunch of people saying we saw triangles in the sky.
Not enough.
It's not enough evidence for aliens. Because the idea of there being aliens that are visiting, I don't doubt that there is extraterrestrial life. I think that considering how big our universe is, it's probably a certainty that there is extraterrestrial life. But the idea that it's coming to our planet and like hovering around in triangles or abducting people, any of the things that people claim is happening, I think that's an extraordinary claim. Just because we know there's no one nearby, they'd have to traverse massive expanses of space to get here.
Well, yeah, they're magical.
Okay, well, if they're magical. But, it's just a very unlikely claim. It's an extraordinary claim. And there's this saying that you'll hear from skeptics all the time: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
That's nice.
And I don't think that some stories about what people saw in the sky or some blurry YouTube videos, that's not extraordinary evidence. The amount of evidence I need to believe something that outlandish, I'd want to see them. I'd want to see good photos. I'd want to see, governmental bodies' reports on this stuff. I'd want serious stuff.
Sure.
I mean, I'd want to go and touch it.
Yeah.
And because no one's able to present anything like that, then the null hypothesis is what you have to go with. If people can't present enough evidence for their claim, then you have to go with it's not true. Because this is another thing that skeptics talk about a lot. It's about the burden of proof. Mm. Like if you come to me and say I've got a pet unicorn, it's not up to me to disprove your pet unicorn.
Right.
You're the one making the claim. You have to prove it's there.
Yeah, yeah.
And
rather than you by default saying, I don't have proof for this, but I don't have disproof, so I'm just going to believe you, the skeptic will take the other side and be like, disproven until you prove the thing.
Yeah, and you know why? Because if you just say, okay, well, I don't have proof it doesn't exist, so I'll just believe it because you're saying it and you seem nice, you end up believing fucking everything, which is the situation I was in the first place. I don't want to go back there. Because if you listen to people, everyone's got their strange claims about the world. That's what makes people so interesting. They've all got interesting perspectives and weird ideas, and they're all throwing stuff out, like throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yes.
So you can't just believe everyone. You have to have some kind of system. And the sensible system is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If they haven't brought to you enough evidence to suggest it's true, then you have to say, that's a really interesting story, but I don't believe you. I mean, you don't have to say it that harsh, but
No, I think that really kind of sums it up, and I love how it kind of all comes back to, well, that was how you found skepticism. You realised that you could not go on that way.
Yeah.
It's almost amazing that most people don't come to that conclusion.
Well, maybe it's because I had such a hunger for this unusual stuff. I was literally seeking it out. I was like, oh, another book about werewolves, I'll read that. I was feeding my brain with all that. If you're just having a normal life and you don't waste your time reading about spontaneous human combustion and werewolves in the kiddie non-fiction section of the library, then when someone says to you, hey, black triangles, you're like, oh yeah, sounds fine if you're saying it.
Yeah, well, that's it. And it's like, that day listening to my brother say that, part of me is like, that could be true, that could not be true, but I'm probably not going to look into it any further.
Yeah.
So whereas there are some people who need to know either way and will form an opinion.
Yeah.
And it sounds like if you are one of those people, probably best that you're skeptic.
Yeah.
Because you're going to believe less crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
I did see
like
a UFO when I was a teenager. I was in my friend's back garden and I was smoking and I was lying on my back and we were looking up at the stars, as you do. And I saw a light in the sky that I didn't recognise. So I pointed to it with my cigarette in my hand. It actually wasn't a cigarette, but I pointed to it and I was like, oh, look at that. And I dropped the spliff and it falls on my neck and burns me. I have a burn here. You can still see it. Can you see it? Yeah. Yeah. And I was like all paranoid because I was stoned. So I didn't want to like knock it off because then it would fall on the blanket we were lying on. It would catch fire and we all might die in a fire. That's what my brain's thinking. So I left it there for like a second whilst I figured out what to do. And then I grabbed it and threw it off and it burnt me quite badly. But it was just a light in the sky that I didn't recognise because I was a teenager and not someone who is familiar with aeronautics,
sure,
I'm just a kid looking up at the sky and I still see stuff that looks unusual in the sky and I just think, well, I'm not an expert in the sky, am I?
It's like that thing about the Chinese lanterns.
Yeah.
Seeing the three lights.
They do look really spooky. Those paper lanterns with the little candle in, right? Yeah, and then they just float up at these really erratic, strange, slow...
And they'll be going together, so you'll see multiple ones moving at a similar slow pace, which is...
Yeah, because everyone lets them off at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're really bad for sea life, apparently. Because they fall back down and then you just got these wire structures landing in the sea.
Well, apparently they've banned it. I thought it was to do with aliens, but maybe it's to do with...
But I think that's another thing about skepticism, what I like about it. It's given me a really profound humility about my ability to know stuff like that. Like if I see strange lights in the sky, my first thought isn't aliens. It's like, oh, you're a bit of a dummy, aren't you? You don't know what that is.
Sure,
like there are people who can look and probably tell you what it is, but you don't know because that's your area of expertise and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like instead of having to figure out what everything is, and if you don't know all the facts, just making up a story to,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, I'm talking like as if I'm speaking for all skeptics, which I'm not. This is my own my own experience of skepticism. And I know there are some skeptics, there are some people of every group who are not nice, and some who are arrogant. But I think if you're doing skepticism right, humility is like the key value, knowing that you can't know everything and being okay with that and getting it's what we're coming back to again about that not being able to control, not being able to know anything for sure and just having to go with the weight of the evidence and that having to be enough. It's like, it's not as satisfying as having everything true written down in one book and then you just flip to the right page and you've got it there. But I think it's just it's a better way to live because you're in a closer relationship with reality. Sure.
And one thing that I also have learned from you and your comics is that is that just because you are seeing the world with this kind of more analytical view doesn't strip away the magic from the world. In fact, it makes you appreciate what's real.
Yeah, if you by magic you mean awe and wonder and all that stuff and poetry and art. Yeah, I love all that stuff. In fact, I take it more seriously in a way because I know how valuable it is and I can't turn to the spiritual. That avenue is not open to me. I'm not prepared to make those compromises to my rationality. So if I need comfort, I have to go to poetry, I have to go to literature, I have to go to art, I have to go to going for a walk in the mountains and looking at...
the beauty of nature, all of that
stuff.
Yeah.
And I take it very seriously. It's something that's really, really important to me in a way that... I wonder... So this is just like a theory I've been tossing around in my head, and it might be nonsense, but I wonder if we valued art more highly and we valued those feelings of awe and wonder about nature more highly, maybe people would be less inclined to go into that kind of spiritual realm.
Right.
Because they could have those emotional and psychological needs satisfied in secular society,
Yeah.
where like you need community, right?
Yeah.
You need community, you need awe, you need beauty, you need majesty, you need to feel like smaller, you need to feel like you're part of something bigger.
Mm-hmm.
You can get all of that from art and science.
Yeah. And the morality of humans, I always think is more amazing when it seems to come from within and not from this external man in the sky saying you must act in this way. And, that's an argument.
Yeah, I mean, if you're just being told, like, if you're just doing good things because you're scared you won't go to heaven if you don't.
Right.
I mean,
it kind of strips the magic away.
It certainly strips the agency away.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a whole different discussion about free will, which could go on forever, and we've had many times before. But that feeling of empowerment of like, I've made choices about how I see the world.
Yeah.
I think this is right and this is wrong, and I'm going to live in accordance with that.
Yeah.
That's pretty powerful, instead of just relying on what your culture tells you, or what a book tells you, or what a man in the sky tells you.
Yeah, for sure. And so where would you recommend, if somebody was looking to get into skepticism or learn more, where would you...
Well, obviously, I'd recommend they buy my book.
Exactly.
So I wrote this comic book, How to Be Reasonable, by someone who tried everything else. That's the subtitle. If you like comic books, you'll probably like it. Or I don't know if you'll like it. But I mean, the idea is just to give people the basis of like, this is what skepticism is, and this is why it's important, and this is what it can do for you, and how it can make your life better. It's a 101 text. And then if you just start looking about, I mean, we'll put a clip at the beginning of this episode of Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan was a famous skeptic and astronomer, and just an amazing guy. And he speaks very passionately and eloquently about skepticism. So you could look for anything that Carl Sagan's ever done, and you get a window into that. He comes from a very scientific, more than a philosophical approach. An interesting thing about skepticism is because the unfortunate word, it gets mixed up with cynicism, which it definitely isn't. And it also gets mixed up, which is a bit more understandable, with philosophical skepticism, which is a whole different kettle of fish. So if you're searching for skepticism, search for skepticism with a K instead of with a C, so the American spelling, because that's where the skeptical movement is strongest, or was strongest in America. So that's kind of, if you're looking for the type of skepticism I'm into, that's what you're looking with a K. And you can search the skeptic movement, just put that into Google. You'll find the Wikipedia page. That'll give you loads of places to start. The other thing I'd say is there's a brilliant YouTube channel. It's the JREF YouTube channel. That's JREF. And on there are loads of lectures, like TED Talk style lectures about topics of interest to skeptics. That's a good place to go. Unfortunately, I mean, the reason I wrote my comic is there is no basic 101 text. Which is a real shame, and hopefully we'll produce one soon. But in the meantime, read my comic book and do a bit of Googling. There are so many skeptic podcasts. Skeptic's Guide to the Universe is one if you're very science-based. TRC, The Reality Check, it's another skeptics podcast. If you're listening to podcasts, you'll like those. But you have to kind of you have to root it out for yourself. We're not a massive movement. And as I said, there's lots of people in this movement, and there's some of them are assholes. So don't be put off if you read someone who seems a bit arrogant, who's just debunking things and telling believers that what they believe is nonsense. There are some of us who are like that. There are some vegans who are unpleasant. There are some of every group that are unpleasant. But the actual core philosophy of skepticism, I really think it's just so empowering, and it's enriched my life so much. I really want people to know more about it. That's part of the reason why we're doing this podcast, because I want to talk to people about it.
Well, I was going to ask, what are your hopes for this podcast? What are your fears?
I'll do hopes first. My hopes are that people who are not skeptics listen, and that they hear me talking about these issues and they think, oh, she's not dismissive. She knows where I'm coming from because she's been there herself. And maybe I could, incorporate some of what she's saying into the way I think about the world. So I would love to just get people who are not necessarily aware of skepticism, just give them a few tools on how to think about the world and how to think about things that are important to them. I just think that's really good. And I like to model good conversation skills because, there is this thing, it's hard to talk to someone with a completely different perspective. And people just generally don't do it because it's hard. Yeah. And what I think is really cool about us is that we do come from different perspectives, although not as dramatically different as is implied by our name, but still, we do come from different perspectives. But that doesn't mean we can't have respectful dialogue. Yeah.
And learn stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like that's the other thing that I want to do from a completely selfish level. I want to do outreach, obviously, but from a selfish level, I want to learn stuff. I want to learn about how to have good conversations. I want to learn about how you see the world. Like, there are certain things that we keep coming back to about the nature of truth, about the whole idea of picking and choosing. How does that, like, what is that about? And is that a legitimate way? Like, these are interesting conversations to have, and I'm not really sure about what the answer.
It's almost like we're learning as we go.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to learn and become a better person by bouncing myself off someone who has such a completely different idea. And it's just lucky that we're both the sort of people who can have these conversations without getting upset. Yeah. Well, I'm not saying, like, you know, I don't think it's illegitimate to get upset. These are emotional topics, and fair enough, people get upset, but it's really nice to have a conversation with someone who's not going to get upset when you contradict their beliefs. And
it would be fun. I think that's what we should aim to do. Let's try and upset each other.
Yeah. And my fears, so there's a couple of fears, I guess. I've got two sides to that. One is that skeptics will listen and they'll think, oh, she's not a real skeptic. I mean, she's a vegan. She meditates. And, you know, I'm not that well read. I'm not a science person. I'm a humanities person. I did my degree in English literature. I'm interested in philosophy. I don't know the science stuff. I'm just going to say a study shows and not say the name of the person who did it.
Yeah, like, and we can only do so much research. We've already found how easy it is to get lost down any rabbit hole.
Exactly. So I fear that skeptics will listen to me and think that I'm not rigorous enough, that I haven't done enough research, like that they'll judge me on those criteria, and probably completely fairly, but it's never nice being judged. And then from the other side, I'm scared that people who are not skeptics will listen and think, oh, she's a bit arrogant and preachy. I really can't win. I'm scared of all of our listeners, is what I'm saying.
I think we need to apply a skeptical eye to all of those beliefs and debunk them. Awesome. Thank you so much for letting me grill you. I hope I did a good job.
Yeah, that wasn't too painful.
Okay.
At times it was painful, but not too painful.
All right, well,
see you next episode.
Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Let us know with a tweet or an email. We'd love to hear about your experiences.
Yes, please tell us what we got wrong. You can email us at hello@seekerandskeptic.com and follow us on Twitter @SeekerSkeptic.
You'll find the show notes for this and every episode at seekerandskeptic.com.
And you can find my skeptically themed comics at RebeccaOnPaper.com or follow me on Twitter @RebeccaOnPaper.
And I'm at Yogis Who Shave on Twitter, and you can find me bringing secular yoga to the masses at yogiswhoshave.com.
If you like what you heard and fancy supporting the show and spreading the word, we'd really appreciate a rating and review in the Apple Podcast Store.
Or tell somebody you know about the show.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.